Thank you. Now we solved a very difficult technical problem, but I was very cautious and I sent it by email to myself at night before coming, and so that worked. So the title of my presentation is Emerging Countries, Winners and Losers in the Trade War. In the past few months, many international organizations have started, also independent analysts have started talking about winners and losers, and many people have done a lot of studies, and I will deal with them very briefly. So the outline of my presentation is the following. I will analyze in the global threefold short run, in what I think that the global threefold short run impact on the trade flows of this tariff war. That is to say, my analysis is concentrated only on the impact on trade flows on the short term, which means analyzing monthly data from databases of the US and China. Then I will go on the three aspects of what I call the impact, that is to say trade contraction on one side, what I call export rerouting and supply switching. And then on the supply switching part, I will see whether we can talk about winners and losers. And finally, I'll talk about some of the drawbacks for the so-called winners. So you know that Trump and I've done a lecture here at the Department of Political Science early this year, in which I analyzed at length this this primitive view of Trump's administration. But in this case, you know, what it interests me is one aspect of this primitive view, and that is to say that the Trump administration thinks that and says that the trade war tends to provoke a damage on the other contender, and that's all. And I want to show you that, in fact, what trade war provokes is a lot of reshuffling in the short term also of the trade flows. So let me define first the concept that I will use, because they're not used in the same way in the literature. I will talk about trade contraction, that's obvious. That's the contraction of trade that takes place on the bilateral relations when there is a trade war, that's obvious. But less obvious are the other two concepts, I mean the use I make of words. I call export rerouting, it's the redirection of trade flows from one of the contenders to other outlets, since they cannot sell anymore to the former. And supply switching is what many people call trade diversion, and that is when other countries try to substitute the exports to the two contenders. You know that I didn't use the typical words of the trade theory, because trade diversion, trade creation, etc., because they apply to welfare analysis. And my analysis is not a welfare analysis. You know, welfare analyses are conducted through CGA models, and they talk about the possible impact. What I'm going to analyze, on the contrary, is what happened to the trade flows in the last few months, okay? And so it's a short-term analysis based on data on flows. I'm sorry, that was a beautiful picture, but it didn't come out. Something got lost. It was a beautiful picture with the arrows. I'll explain to you. Okay, so there are three parts: US, China, and the rest of the world. And so there is first trade contraction. The trade contraction between US and China, obvious. Okay, so the imports and exports of each other contract. Then there is the two contenders try to reroute, I called it, although it's, as I said in the literature, it's used in a different way, try to redirect their trade flows somewhere else, okay? So US trying to redirect to the rest of the world. China tries to redirect to the rest of the world, okay? And then finally, there is the most interesting aspect, which I will concentrate later on, is the supply switching. That is to say, some of the countries in the rest of the world try to sell more to the US since China has left some void, and the same with China. They try to go to the market, to the Chinese market, okay? So this is, okay, so as I said, I used monthly data, and the monthly data are the most recent ones as compared. So what I did is I make a comparison between the monthly data of January, July of this year with January and July of last year. So this seems, okay, any choice is arbitrary in a way, but this seems fair since in the first part of 2018, the impact of the trade war was not felt so much yet, while in these latest months, probably it has been felt. And so I make a comparison of the trade flows. So the databases are the US Census Bureau for the US market, and the customs database for the Chinese, or the Chinese government. Lots of problems with the Chinese statistics, but anyway, I won't deal with that. The winners and losers so are very narrowly defined, but winners with a question mark, losers the same, are defined only in terms of increases and decreases of trade. So this is a first stage of research, and also it's a first stage in the sense that it is conducted on global trade. Naturally, a better analysis should be conducted at a product level, but I didn't really have time and the resources to do that. And it should be done for all the countries involved at the product level. So you can imagine what kind of work this is, okay? So trade contraction, very fast trade contraction is obvious, the obvious concept, and the total imports were very, look only at the percentages because the data have been changed in the last version, which is not this one. So the imports from China contracted 9% roughly, and the other side, they contracted by 28%, okay? So this is a large contraction. Take, for instance, to give you a reference, in 2018, US imports from China were more than $530 billion, okay? And her exports were much less, okay? Were $120 billion. So I won't talk anymore about this data, but I mean, and so the deficit was $419 billion, okay? So this is just all the references since I've done only, you will see only ratios and shares. You won't see data anymore because that's, for the concepts I'm using, that's an important thing. So that was a big contraction, and it hit probably much more, I've seen it in the data, much more those products which were hit by the tariffs in particular, okay? The more interesting aspects here are, has there been any rerouting? This is China, and I'm concentrating on China, not in the US. China has been able to reroute some of her exports somewhere else or not, okay? So that's interesting. And so this is a first indicator, very simple, etc. As I was telling Carlos last night, I'm working on something more sophisticated. But just for the moment, how much did her exports in these months increase towards other sources? So that could be an indirect indicator, but it's not perfect by any means. And so this is what I found. Okay, it's colorful and beautiful, and so in fact, that was, what I did is to compare the amount of the increase of exports towards other sources to the decrease of China's exports towards the US. So the total amount of decrease, okay, that China had on the US markets, I compare the increase to other sources, to each other source. And so Vietnam stands out as the most important redirection of exports for an amount equal to 1/3 of what she lost on the US market, okay? So this is based upon US data, okay? And so the same comes out in the following. So it's in the order: Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, Philippines, Korea, Mexico, Indonesia, Cambodia, Singapore, Myanmar, etc., etc. These are very small fractions. It means not relevant. Which means that, as you can see, the rerouting of exports of China has gone mainly to Asian countries, neighboring countries, except Mexico. So Mexico, you will see it's a very important country in my analysis, is the only country in which there has been some rerouting, and I take it, you know, until Mexico is something interesting enough that it's only 0 point, etc. It's not so important, okay? And on the contrary, at the same time, you can see, at the same time, China lost positions in some other countries, okay? Okay, so this is an outlier, Hong Kong. Hong Kong is an outlier because whenever I teach about export flows and you see all the ranking, etc., I always say that a lot of those data for Singapore, for Hong Kong should be added to China because there's a lot of Chinese trade going through Hong Kong. So this is an outlier, but it means that it could be added to the losses of China in a way. And the others are Turkey, Pakistan, Argentina, India, Brazil. So you can see some of these countries which will be, like Brazil, very important and interesting on the import side or on the winners and losers, etc. China didn't acquire new positions in their markets. So how important is this same rerouting, the amount, compared to the trade flows relative to each country? For some of these countries, this rerouting of Chinese products has been more important than for others. So some of the countries that you have seen on which markets China has gained very little market, in fact, for them, it's rather important. Yes? Yeah. Yeah, I didn't say that. Don't analyze. So in fact, the main gain in terms of quantity, in terms of values, was with the European Union, but that's outside of the concentrated on emerging countries. So in fact, it comes out of the analysis, and it fits very well in some of the discussions we had yesterday. In fact, you know, all this trade war has caused until now is a big shifting of Chinese trade towards the EU and away from the US. Okay, so which means that has been a lot of resilience in a way of Chinese exports, and they could have reoriented for a large part, okay, towards. And that was for a reference. You did very well to call our attention to that, because this is, although this is away from, apart from my analysis, I put it because it has to be understood. So that also could offset those losses, even through the Hong Kong market. So now, how does it compare for each country? For some of the small countries where you had 0 point, etc., in fact, it could be rather relevant relative to the level of imports and exports that they had with China. Okay, and that's the other picture. And there you can see that it's almost 1/4 of Cambodian flows with China. Okay, so, or Laos, etc. But those are not a marginal markets for the moment for China, still for that. On the contrary, for Vietnam, it was 13%. So Vietnam is a case apart, and we'll have a lot of talk about that. But also Malaysia, Philippines, Taiwan, very important. So in this first round of picture, while, for instance, it was in the negative side, very important for Argentina, Turkey, and Pakistan. So in this first round, you can see that there are, apart from the emerging countries, not very developed countries, there are always two countries, Taiwan, Singapore, and even Korea, you will see, that stand out as countries which have a role in this reshuffling of trade with China, which is very important, which ties up also with some of the things we said about supply chains, although the effect of the disrupting of supply chains cannot be seen yet fully, okay? But partly, yes. Okay, this is just to recall you that the major markets for China now, that's the last data, the last 9 months. Now the EU has become the main export market, okay? And United States second. And you see, the data show that Hong Kong is the third largest market. As I said, we don't know where these exports go, or else one should analyze Hong Kong's data and then make an estimate of how much they are Chinese, okay? And that's very interesting that the EU has surpassed United States as a major market in the last months. Those are the first 9 months, based on the monthly data. Okay, so summing up, I sum up. One could say that China has succeeded in redirecting a lot of her exports away from the US towards other destinations, okay? And the largest amount, as Carlos pointed out, but I would have said in my comments, was destined to the EU. The value of the amount was 65% of the losses, okay? We don't know whether they are exactly the losses, but I mean, the amount compared is 65%. And among the emerging countries, Vietnam stands out as the most important one, Malaysia second, so those are, but also Taiwan for almost 15%. So, as I said before, mostly towards Asian countries, and at the exception of these 4 countries that I mentioned there, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, etc., etc. The decrease, as I said, Hong Kong is a case of us already. For Latin America, there's been some redirection or rerouting, as I called it, towards Mexico, very little towards other countries which are marginal for China, but still, it seems that they export quite a lot, Peru and Colombia. Why there was an export contraction towards the other Latin American countries, okay? That's for China. Supply switching, don't consider the US reaction. And now we come to the core, supply switching. That is to say, but then other countries could substitute the two contenders in each other's market, and can they be called, or are they called there? In fact, in some of the literature, they're called winners, okay? So I separated the two effects. That is to say, I don't take it completely. I saw a study by UNCTAD, but it was a prospective study. That is computable general equilibrium, etc., usual things. This is, on the contrary, on real data. They put the two effects together. No, I separate them. So let's first analyze on the US market, based upon US Census Bureau data. So this is just to give you an idea, the absolute amounts, but I mean, don't look at the millions and billions, because there was a bit of, I changed the thing, but just, you see, this is the contraction, okay? This is the contraction of imports from China in the US market, okay? So this is the amount, okay? It's very big, you can see. And these are the gains and the losses on top, okay? These are the losses. So the gains of on China's market, on the US markets the gains of emerging countries are larger than the losses of, apart from China, okay? You can see the losses concern very few countries, or the emerging countries that are the most important ones. That is to say Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Hong Kong, Peru, and Indonesia. Hong Kong, the usual caveat. On the contrary, the most important countries that gained in the US market were Mexico first. So this is contrary to what many people have been thinking, that Vietnam is the biggest winner, etc. It's not true. Mexico is the biggest winner. And you will see, Mexico is a winner, both, you will see, both in the US market and partly also in the Chinese market. So Mexico is the one which is clear winner according to this data. And then Vietnam. So for Vietnam it's very important though, because Mexico is much larger in terms of economy, etc. So Mexico, Vietnam, and then you have the two very developed, I call them very developed emerging countries like Taiwan and Korea, then India, Singapore, and much less Argentina, Turkey, etc., etc. Argentina too is an interesting case. Argentina succeeded in increasing exports both to the US market and you will see also to the Chinese market. So it's a case, interesting case, but very much smaller place. Okay, these are the countries: Mexico, Vietnam, Korea, Taiwan, and India, and Singapore. Okay, 3 of them are very developed, the emerging countries. And then I conducted the same type of analysis. How I compare it to the value of the Chinese losses, and you can see that Mexico has the biggest, as we have seen, then Vietnam. So compared to the Chinese losses, more than 40%, Mexico, and Vietnam is 33%. Of course, you don't have to think that they add up to 100. So these are values, and then I compare them to the losses of China, and then Korea, Taiwan, India, and Singapore. That was the same data that I put before in a comparative perspective to the losses of China. And I did the same with the losses on the right-hand side, okay? For some of the countries, these are very important, okay? I did the same thing as before. That is to say, and again, some of the countries which are very bad and not very much represented, for them it has been very important. For Laos, for example, it represents more than 100% more than they used to be in 2018, okay? That compared to the 2018 flows, okay? So there was a big jump, okay? But from a very low level, so it's so for Egypt, Burma is Myanmar, but the U.S. Census Bureau writes Burma. So I left it, but I corrected it in the other version because otherwise it doesn't fit. But you can see here what is important is Vietnam, because Vietnam had a rather large amount, and it is still almost 40%, so it's rather important for them, for her exports. Almost 40% more for Vietnam is much more important than 100% more for Laos, let's say, okay? And Korea, Taiwan, Singapore also 20% more is very important. Those are countries that export already a lot, okay? So this is the type of analysis. So in the US market, just let's resume. So 7 countries that benefited, 7 countries that benefited the most in the US market were Mexico, Vietnam, South Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, India, Singapore, and Argentina. 5 Asian countries and 2 Latin American countries, okay? And among the biggest losers, 4 Latin American countries, 1 Asian country is Indonesia. All in all, as I said, the global value of the gains outweigh by far the global value of the losses of those emerging countries, okay? And, okay, so the rest, okay, that I've done already when I analyzed. Okay, in the China's market. So this is so thing because I'm using here the Chinese statistics, and I had a lot of problems with the Chinese statistics. Anyway, so in the Chinese market, I did exactly the same type of analysis. I don't explain it anymore, okay? And you can see here, and in the Chinese market, in compared to the US losses, I don't report it here, the US losses, Korea has lost a lot, okay? And this can tie up with those things that we were saying about the supply side. And Taiwan, you can see it, Korea and Taiwan are the ones which lost most. That's interesting. It means that probably, I don't know exactly, but probably that this disruption of supply chain has taken place already, okay? Mm-hmm. And then Indonesia is important, and Singapore. So three are very developed emerging countries, Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan, and the other one is Indonesia. Many other countries, on the contrary, they gained. Brazil, Argentina, so Brazil, we talk about it, and Malaysia are very important. Again, Hong Kong is not allowed. And this has been rather important for some countries. Here I put the losses of the United States, okay? But in terms of the January-July 2018 imports, and for Egypt has been important, but Egypt flows are not so important in China. But for Korea, Pakistan, and Turkey, and Taiwan, this could have been rather important. On the contrary, on the good side, for Argentina, there's been a jump, okay? For Argentina, there's been a jump, and it's slightly less for Mexico, but still positive, okay? And what else there is interesting? Okay, and some of these have, they count very little, but there's been a jump. Cambodia, Myanmar. Here I use Myanmar, not Burma, as before. And just for the last thing, there's something everybody thinks, soybeans has been a very important case, of rerouting, of changing of supply switching. That's true, but that's not true in the period I'm considering so much because it had already taken place. And you can see the imports of soybeans from the United States and Brazil have gone this way since 2018, which means it started before. You can see already from 2016 to 2017, the imports of Chinese imports of soybeans have started increasing very much from Brazil and decreasing starting from 2017 from the US. And you can see this picture is a clear case of supply switching. Soybeans is a very important product for China, for the Chinese market, okay? Okay, so winners and losers in China markets. There are some differences from the previous case. The 7 countries that benefit the most appear to be Malaysia, Brazil, Argentina, Myanmar, very, very little, India, Cambodia, Mexico, important, and Bangladesh. 5 Asian countries and 3 Latin American countries. That's something like jumped. All other emerging countries seem to have lost in the Chinese market, which means that in the Chinese market is a mirror image. The losers have lost more than the winners, okay? And on the contrary, in the US market, I remind you that the winners have been. So probably one of the reasons is the conflicting specializations with the Chinese economy and of these countries, okay? Let me remember you that the China's major suppliers have been in the last period, in the last 9 months, the EU, Japan, Taiwan, US 4th, okay? So EU, Japan, Taiwan, and US is only 4, and then Brazil. And that's very important for the analysis because when we talk about, okay, global appraiser, winners and losers, which countries are on both sides of on both markets they won? Mexico. Mexico is the most important case, although it's much more skewed towards the US market, that is to say, has gained much more in the US market than in the Chinese market. Argentina too, comes on the two winning side, although much lower level of trade. In Asia, Malaysia and other countries are marginal, like Laos. I mean, gained, but very little. It doesn't count so much. In most cases, emerging countries have showed that they gained in one market and lost in another. That's the case for the most important case is Vietnam. Vietnam has gained a lot on the US market, lost much less on the Chinese market. And also, this happens for South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and for those countries, I imagine that that's one of the reasons is the disruption on the supply chains, okay? And there are two countries which lose on both markets, Indonesia and Chile, okay? Altogether, a big reshuffling in the short term of trade, which is contrary to what the Trump administration has always said. All that glitters is gold? Well, I'm not so sure. There are lots of problems. There are lots of problems for the winners I'm talking about, of course. Gold is the winners, of course. Let's very fast, each case should be analyzed separately, but I mean, the soybean market is booming now. Lots of countries are increasing their export to China, for instance. Also Argentina, by the way, has started increasing soybeans. But Brazil, for instance, but in Brazil it's causing a lot of problems because many Brazilians are very reluctant to make new investments because they don't know whether this trade war goes on or not, etc. And the ones who are working in the sectors which use soybeans as inputs, that is as an intermediate product, they might lose competitiveness because in the meanwhile the price of soybeans have gone up. New demand prices have gone up. Vietnam also has been, there are plenty of reports on factories which have been overwhelmed, that they can't take additional projects, and port congestions, rising land and wage prices, etc., etc. So these are problems. And also, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore seems to suffer from a lot of damage for this trade war. Okay, and okay, well, I see that she's getting a bit. Yes, yeah. Okay. So, to final note, even for the winners, some negative global effects might possibly dominate in the longer term, and that is caused by the possibility of recession in the economy and global economy, and the escalation of a trade war. We have seen a recent case now, and so this will, and in the end, will damage weaker countries, that is to say, weaker countries in the world, and also the countries which have been winning, they could be less represented at the world level because, if there is no more an international system like the WTO, even a reformed WTO, this could have a bad effect on the weaker countries. So the end result might be, in the longer term, I have a pessimist view for the moment. These winners might be very short-run winners, unless the trade war resumes and then there's been a reshuffling of the trade flows, etc., and the new trade flows can be kept. Okay, so this is the analysis, which stops at the first level of analysis. You'll hear from me later in the year for new data and new analysis. Probably the best thing will be when we have all the data for the year, and then we compare them to 2018. So I won't have any more to work only on monthly data, which is a painstaking work and possibly source of many computing errors. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, for this very interesting presentation. Now we can collect some short questions. If you agree, we can collect all the questions and then you can give a unique reply.
decide more when they make a question whether I want to answer right away, because it could
Okay,
be,
okay,
because,
okay,
if
very punctual.
somebody asks question on data and the other question on big issues, you don't fit together.
Okay, any questions? Yeah, Vittorio and then Carlos. Please, Vittorio.
Your analysis is based upon loss and trade.
Yeah, only. So it's a very limited thing.
But if you consider also the interaction between trade and foreign direct investment,
I didn't.
not usable.
Yeah.
You can say, for instance, that the Mexico and the Vietnam cases that have been important
Mm-hmm.
your analysis trade can be partly explained also by changing in the direct investment flow.
So the foreign direct investment is something that moves in a much different way than trade, right? So it's much slower, etc., and the data, is all kinds of problems. So in fact, one could do is to analyze the foreign direct investment data of, say, 2 years before, 2, 3, 4 years before, and then see whether they had an impact on trade flows. But that's an estimate. I mean, it's you can never say that, when these foreign direct investments will have an impact on trade flows. Okay, so this is pure analysis of what happened on trade flows. The source of that, I said, for Taiwan, and could be for the disruption, but we don't have, a causal relationship with anything. We can presume, but that would be interesting, but it would be rather, say, daring to make such a comparison with foreign direct investment, although it would be interesting, though it could be done, yes. Carlos?
I like your analysis very much, and even if you call it limited,
Mm-hmm. I could apply to myself what I said about Trump. For the moment, it's primitive, but primitive based upon real data.
I think that this is not a question, it's a suggestion. The question is, have you thought about going into the sectors? Because remember that both
so you want to. So you want to know what is my next work? I mean, what I'm doing now? No, I started already, but I didn't produce it. So what I'm going to do is to look at the products on which tariffs have been imposed, okay, and then to analyze products, most important products, okay, by sectors and by countries. So there are 20 countries. Or probably I will choose 10, the most important ones, and see what happened to that. Because that's more interesting. But I mean, I couldn't do it, I don't have.
Not only interesting, because the thing is that the way you put the presentation seems that the changes in trade flows, there's some sort of causal relationship.
No. And that's the reason why I said.
It could be that some of them are just
very good.
Because they're more competitive.
Okay. So those are, there was a part which was called caveats, and I have it here. And it says, one part of the caveats was this, trade flows may be due, the changes may be due to many aspects, okay? So one is what Carlos is saying, okay? So normal trade changes. Second, there could be due to changes of exporters and importers' behavior. Exporters can behave in a different way, in the sense that in front of a tariff or tariffs, they can keep, they can lower the prices, etc., for instance. Or the importers might decide, as where is Francesco? Francesco was saying, importers may decide, to cover some of the costs, okay, and not to, etc., etc. And so it could be overstated, those data, because you could keep the same flows, okay? But there is another interesting, and I didn't talk about it, but I thought that maybe our presenters on Vietnam will say, and there's been there have been news about some mislabeling of products, Chinese products, going through Vietnam and also through Cambodia, okay? And so products that were going to Vietnam, they're mislabeled and labeled as made in Vietnam and sold to the United States. The Vietnamese government has said as well that, so I'm not saying. But this is one aspect, but I believe that's marginal on the trade flows, but this has happened, which means that it could enhance the trade flows data, the short-run trade flow of Vietnam, first of all, Cambodia. But second, there's another phenomenon which I think it's even more serious. It's called knocking down. That is to say, you can knock down, especially in electronic products, etc. You can knock down the products into different parts, then send these products to, has been done, I think, in Vietnam and Taiwan, I think, or Korea, I can't remember, and then sold to the United States, reassembled and sold to the United States, and that's legal, okay? The first one is illegal, the second is legal. And this, it seems to have taken place, but again, probably it's marginal, and again, probably it takes place every time that there are tariffs in the world. Every time that there are tariffs in the world, exporters try to, the exporters try to avoid, etc., etc. So these are the things that, yes, I wanted to say. There are a few other comments on the data, of course, because I said they are primitive in the sense that, you take them at face value and they say, that's what happens. Well, what are the causes? Well, that's the big question mark, okay? So no, there is a correlation in okay, from a statistical point of view, in my analysis, there is a correlation, no causation. As the old say says, correlation is no causation. They taught me that. Yes, sorry. Augusto.
Just one curiosity. You showed us that the most important winners are Mexico and Vietnam. Mexico will be the winner.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Vietnam, especially in the...
You were able to mention a lot of troubles in the Vietnam case.
Well, but that's an example, but in many other cases too.
My question is very simple. To understand what happened to Mexico, because it is not written. So, my question is the success of the country, of an emerging country, in a very little period, means also a rise of inflation, a rise of other problems and so on,
Sure.
congestion problems. I wanted to add.
Well, it seems that you have seen prices start. I mean, in Vietnam, for instance, according to the reports, they seem to have a problem in the labor market. The labor market seems to be tightening. But of course, this is such a short run. This is a short run. So you can't say, probably in some cases it may be due to other causes. This probably it would have happened the same even without the trade war. Or even without this export jump. But certainly export jumps of such a dimension, like in Vietnam and Mexico, may create further additional progress. I'm not saying that they are the basis. And probably if I go and study better the Mexican market, it would be very similar. Okay, so it's so each country should be studied by itself. You can never have that's the reason why I'm waiting with eagerness what you're going to say about Vietnam, because you have a clearer picture, of course. This is a global analysis based only on trade data, current trade data, so it has to be very limited by nature.
Giovanni, that's the very last question.
I think that the case of Vietnam, in fact, is very interesting because trade wars came after a period of relocation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So added to some very strong previous. So we learn after the conflict.
Last word about what you said about relocation. This knockdown business that I talked about could be also a phenomenon which diminishes this idea or this dimension of relocation. Some of the relocation is not real relocation, okay? It's just a knocking down problem. And the knocking down, by the way, is a phenomenon which is much easier to take away once the trade war goes away, because, you know, there are pieces, and they're not, you know, firms that go away. They are just parts of products which are assembled somewhere, etc., etc. So it's much easier to take it back to wherever, you know, China or other countries, okay? So that's interesting, this phenomenon. If one could study that by itself, it would be very, very interesting.
Okay,
so it's just, practically it's a kind of what we have to study for the next future, more than what we have achieved until now, okay?
Thank you so much.
Okay.